it so much you may even get tired of winning.
Are you expecting a recession this year?
I hate to predict things like that. There is a period of transition. It takes a little time.
Welcome to Is It Bad for the Economy, the podcast where we interrogate whether Trump's economic policies are good, bad, or just a load of hot air. My name is Kobi. I'm a Democratic political media consultant trying to rebuild after the 2024 election and figure out how the Democratic Party can once again become the party of economic mobility and prosperity. Keeping me honest is my co-host Banker Bill. Bill has an MBA, works for a global systemically important bank, which I just learned is Banker for Top Shelf, and is a fiercely independent voter who will support any candidate he thinks will protect his bottom line. For Bill and I, this is our 7th episode, but for most of you, it'll be your first. Welcome. Thank you to all of our friends and family who gave us the amazing feedback we needed to claw our way to competency during our private preview episodes. They started getting really good there at the end, so if you go to isitbadfortheeconomy.com and sign up for our email list, we'll send you the last 2 preview episodes on sports gambling and the cryptocurrency reserve. And please give us those 5 stars and drop a review wherever you get your podcasts. It's the number one way we can reach a bigger audience and make sure that we don't have any more manufactured recessions in the future. Today, we're talking about a topic that's a little less sexy than sports gambling and cryptocurrency, but I think is going to set an important foundation for almost every one of our episodes moving forward. U.S. national debt and the deficit. The Republican Party's reputation as deficit hawks is as ingrained in our political culture as it is fraudulent. Republicans love to shut down Democratic spending proposals by crying deficit, but of course, that's a crisis of their own making. Since Democratic President Bill Clinton did the impossible and balanced the budget, adjusted for inflation, Trump and W have inflated the national debt by almost $1 trillion more than Obama and Biden. But as far as I can tell, it's never been true that Republicans have been better on deficit spending. Going all the way back to 1913, Republicans have added on average $170 billion more to the debt than Democrats on average per presidential term. And of course, the only president who's ever paid off the national debt was a Democrat. But this is probably the last time you'll ever hear me claim him. But forget about ancient history. Banker Bill, how would you describe the current debt and deficit situation?
So it's as bad as it's been in a very long time. So as of the most recent figures, the deficit is 6.3% to GDP. So in layman's terms, that means we are spending $23 and we're only bringing in about $17. And we did the same last year. Now, I said it was 6.3%. Going back to the 1930s, the median is 2.6%. The average is 3.3%. So significant rise. In the last 10 years, the median's 5% deficit. The average is 6%. So this is increasingly becoming a bigger problem. And we see it ourselves through higher interest rates, higher long-term interest rates, and reductions in service by way of having to spend more money to service the debt that we have.
So we hear a lot about a debt crisis. A lot of people talk about this issue like there's a cliff to fall off of. What would a debt crisis actually look like?
Well, there's many examples throughout history. Let's focus on a couple that are recent. So in the early 80s, there was a Latin American debt crisis. It wrapped up several countries down in Latin America. And in fact, Mexico had a sovereign default. And often what it looks like, it's not like in a household where someone's in a common repo, your car or your bed frame. Okay. Oftentimes it means a restructuring of debt, a depreciation in the currency. Most of these debt crises, whether they're large countries at the time or small countries at the time, you see the following. You see incomes drop, you see imports drop, you see unemployment go up, you see government and household borrowing costs rise, and you see the value of a currency drop relative to foreign currencies. All of those things are bad. All of those things are what you want to head off and make sure you never have to experience.
Well, I think the first part of that's really interesting, right? It really isn't like a household. I think in a lot of ways we understand that household metaphor, debt equals bad. But at the same time, I think we also all understand that treasury bonds are good. We don't have to sort of imagine the stability and security that owning a treasury bond really gives you, because most of us, have that bond. We are experiencing that stability for ourselves. But the idea that there is an upper limit that there are consequences if this gets too bad. I think that makes a lot of sense too. And these days we hear a lot about modern monetary theory. There's a lot of people who are saying that if the debt crisis has gotten as bad as it really is right now, and there haven't been that bad of consequences yet, does this stuff really matter? Do you think that there is any merit to the other extreme idea that sovereign debt, especially American sovereign debt, doesn't matter?
It does matter. There's a lot of discussion over modern monetary theory. I think it boils down to kind of an accounting framework. And there's two key tenets to it. First is, it's what you're alluding to. If the government controls its currency, which the United States does, it can just print money without regard. It can print as much money as it needs and mostly be able to negate any negative effects such as inflation. Now, there's a second key tenet to it. There's no resource constraints, which means you can print money as much as you need, and that money goes to basically an infinite amount of goods or supply, right? But we don't have that. We do have resource constraints. We do have labor constraints, energy constraints, logistics constraints. And to an extent, we did sort of try MMT in the pandemic, okay? In March of 2020, Congress passed and Donald Trump signed a $2.3 trillion stimulus bill. In December of 2020, that same Congress passed another $900 billion stimulus. In early 21, we had the newly elected Biden administration signed into law I think it was the American Rescue Plan. That was another $1.9 trillion. So that's $5.1 trillion in approved spending. That, for the most part, is driving the deficit that I mentioned earlier. And we did the first part of that. We did print the money. The second part is we didn't have the supply to be able to take up the slack for that money. And what are we seeing? Increased inflation, pressure on supply, too much demand chasing too few goods, right? Too much money chasing too few goods. And the value for money, I think, hasn't been there. That's the challenge that we see with the deficit today, is that we bring out the monetary bazooka or the fiscal bazooka and stimulate, and then the bang for the buck just hasn't been there. I mean, we've spent all of the stimulus, and we are still only about achieving 3% real GDP growth. 3% real GDP growth is what you would target without all that extra stimulus, in the steady state. So if we can't grow our way out of the stimulus that we're passing, that we're putting in there through real GDP, that really represents the problem.
But how can you say that if our country faced a historically unprecedented economic challenge in the pandemic, Trump spends all this money, does the historically unprecedented move of actually putting cash directly into people's pockets by sending them checks, something I think that only Trump could have gotten away with. Biden finishes that job, then, puts constraints on, reins it back in, pulls off the soft landing, manages to get that inflation under control without crashing the economy, without triggering the recession. Couldn't you argue that that's sort of exactly how you're supposed to do it, that was a successful exercise?
In retrospect, it looks like that total number, however you want to split it up, is probably too much. And that the first bill that came in the Trump administration was too big, and so was the 2021 bill that Biden passed. That said, it's okay that was the reaction function in such an unprecedented moment. Okay? You went too far. You'd rather go too far than not enough at the time. Okay? But now we have to be able to come together and say, hey, just like we did then, and those bills were bipartisanly passed, come back to the table and say, hey, we probably spent a little too much. The money that we did put out there, we have to follow up on and make sure we're getting the best bang for our buck, the best return on that dollar, right, to make it back in the long run. And then money that hasn't been spent yet, should we spend it at all, and what's the best allocation for it?
So are Trump's cuts, are the $2 trillion, are they what we have to do to rein it back in, to be responsible again, or are they way too much?
So there's this thing of this 3-3-3 plan that I hear from the Commerce Secretary, the Treasury Secretary, versus the $2 trillion just raw number here from Trump, which is a 3% deficit, current account deficit, 3% real GDP growth, and 3 million barrels additional oil production per day from current. Looking at the cuts, if you were to cut 10% of the federal workforce, that comes out to a savings of about $35 billion. That's 1/10 of 1% of GDP. So if you want to get to this 3% deficit, you have to cut $300 billion. Cutting 10% of the workforce only gets you 35. So while it's a dent, Kobe, it's only 10% of that year one target. And they want to cut that amount successively each year for the next 4 years. So while those cuts will have a drag on the economy, right, because it's less government spending, the expectation is putting those workers back into hopefully what will be the private sector in similarly paying jobs. The government will be a net beneficiary. The risk is if those people can't find a job, right, or take a job that's less than what they were making or producing with the federal government, then, you know, the government is actually going to ultimately collect less tax revenue, and the resulting firing of them won't save as much money. Is that clear?
I think that makes sense. You know, unfortunately, I think this is another case of Trump finding a reasonable person to come out and say something reasonable that has absolutely no bearing with the actions that Trump is taking or Trump's mindset or how Trump's mind shift might change 5 minutes from now. I think that if you look at places like Washington, D.C., when I talk to my friends here in town, 10% of cuts sounds lovely compared to the complete chaos, the utter destruction, the intense fiscal uncertainty that anybody who works with the federal government, who works with an organization that's funded with the federal government is feeling right now. And everybody I'm talking to who's in that position has zero confidence that they're going to get any sort of job anywhere. So I love that story that you're telling, but I think it's completely out of step with what's happening on the ground. Or am I just biased because I know too many people who work for the federal government?
All I'm saying is you cut 10%, you're going to save $35 billion a year. That's 10% of what the Treasury Secretary is trying to get to. Where's the other 90% come from? If you cut every single person at the federal government level, every single person, that would only get you a third of the way that the Treasury Secretary is telling us he wants to get to over the next 4 years. So where are the other cuts coming from? These are the cuts that are getting all the publicity because it's the people, right? The people matter, and they're the ones losing jobs, and those are the stories that are being told, and that's what you talked about earlier is in previous episodes is about telling those stories. But this, I mean, you know, the bank, as far as getting the most out of it, there's a limit to what you can get.
Are you seeing significant cuts on top of the layoffs that, you know, we're not seeing, that we're getting distracted by those layoffs?
No, I mean, we'll have to see. All the cuts so far under the discretionary budget, right? Which is like if the federal outlays are $7, right? I'm equating that to trillion, $7. And government spending that Trump has immediate purview over is about $1. Interest on the debt's another dollar, so that's $2. And then the other $5 is coming from quote unquote entitlement spending, Social Security, Medicare, veterans benefits, all that stuff. So all this stuff we're hearing about now is only in that billion-ish bucket, right? So even if he cuts that 30%, right, say that's $300 billion, that's only getting 1/3 of where we really need to go.
And that's where I'm just starting to get totally upset on this issue. You've told me about this complete rational plan that's going to only cut 10%, that's going to space it out over time, that's going to make sure the economy can handle it, that has no bearing with the chainsaw that Trump's taking to the federal government right now. And I think that it just really brings us into this hyper-partisan space where we get this extreme austerity that punishes the working class, that punishes the middle class. There are no political consequences for tax cuts for the rich, for trying to solve the deficit problem on the revenue side. And so we end up in this situation where it's the opposite of have your cake and eat it too. We end up paying for the cake and we don't get to eat it. They take away spending in all the ways that impact us directly, that are literally putting people to work, making life better for the American people, making sure that the benefits of government actually reach the American people. They're not cutting in ways that are actually going to get the deficit under control, which could actually lead to more economic stability and prosperity that would trickle down to the American middle class, that would give them a payoff for that sacrifice they're making on the front end. So it's all sacrifice. It's no payoff, because if Trump doesn't back up these layoffs, then this was just an exercise in punishing Americans.
Look, I hear where you're coming from. I don't think it has to be that dire. You said austerity. I don't think we're looking at European style austerity.
You don't think the situation we're dealing with right now, where the federal government is cutting all spending so that any professor in the country doesn't know if their work is being funded right now? Every federal employee in the country doesn't know if their work is being funded right now. Every contractor who services the federal government doesn't know whether their job's going to be there tomorrow. You don't think that threatening all those people's jobs, threatening the ability of the government to get Social Security checks out on time, that's not extreme austerity?
I don't think it's austere. No, it's uncertainty. Sure. I'm not saying it's a good thing. We are still running a deep budget deficit. Even if all of the cuts you mentioned were to go through,
right.
You're not in an austere economic, or I should say an austere fiscal situation, because you're still spending way more than you bring in. We are not looking to have a balanced budget here. Right. That's what like austerity would mean to me. We're not looking for European style austerity that we saw in the early 2010s. The Treasury Secretary himself in that 333 plan said 3% deficit to GDP. That's kind of the long term of where we've been. I think we should really be targeting 2%, in that the hope you'll get to 3%. But this is another way in which the government and the way it can operate is not like a household. The household cannot create its own money. And the biggest difference, but the least considered, is debt details. Households have to repay over time the liabilities they have, your mortgage, right, your credit cards, etc. Governments can roll over their debt indefinitely, so long as creditors trust that the government has the ability to pay. So in that way, the debt's not free, but in a way, too, you have unlimited access to debt, provided you are giving the market confidence that you'll repay it. And they are targeting that 3% deficit to GDP number. We are at a 6.3% deficit. So they're trying to cut that budget deficit in half. It sounds like they're going to try to do it all through cost cutting and not really much through revenues. But the point of austere economic conditions, and we have to quote unquote suffer. I think suffer is a tough word. Hey, look, there's going to be incremental hardship. I'm not saying there's not. But I don't think you're going to see necessarily people on the streets kind of a situation. Spain in the 2010s, 25% unemployment among 25-year-olds and under. I don't think we're going to see that kind of condition here. But we do have to get our fiscal house in order and show that we can, in order to reduce borrowing costs for everybody. And those who will be the direct recipients or beneficiaries of those reduced borrowing costs in particular will be typical Americans.
Can you look me in the eye right now and tell me with a straight face that the Trump administration, not the Treasury Secretary, but the Trump administration from top to bottom, is executing a comprehensive budgetary plan that is going to bring down the debt in a responsible way?
In a word, no. And that's consensus, because you've seen the stock market hem in all of the gains that were seen, the paper gains that were seen in the run-up after the election. Now you have all this uncertainty, both in terms of trade, economic trade, export, import, and government spending. Their gambit, their gambit is that they're going to be able to cut whatever amount of money it is, however many number of people it is, and they're not going to see a distortion in service. So that's their bet. They're betting that they can cut all of this
ridiculous
stuff. Hey, we're going to find out.
No, but we're already finding out. There are already veterans who aren't getting the services they should be getting because there were VA workers that were laid off. There's already professors right now whose work isn't being funded, who are just twiddling their fingers until the universities can't pay their salaries anymore. It's already happening. And so for you to say, oh, 2%, 3%, no, people are suffering now. You've already said the cuts aren't enough that they're actually going to have an economic payoff. And you've already told me that you can't say with any confidence that these guys are going to keep us out of the recession we appear to be on a trajectory on.
Is your position, what is your expectation that the cuts that they're making now in the discretionary spending will have a larger impact to GDP or a smaller impact to GDP relative to the spend?
I don't
So if
care.
if they spend $100 billion, is that going to affect the private sector $105 billion or $50 billion?
I'm saying that the people I know are suffering because of budget cuts right now.
Yeah, basically there's layoffs. The government's
You've
telling
already,
you we're losing money and we're going to lay people off, just like a private enterprise would.
okay. You've already said that the cuts that are in motion right now, that people are suffering from right now, that have already put us on the trajectory for a recession right now, are not going to actually put a significant dent into the deficit, the debt issue.
That's right. If you cut 10%, $35 billion.
Right.
We have to cut something like.
So the Republicans get to come in, they get to say deficit, 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 debt, 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 debt. You suffer, you suffer, you suffer. You get laid off, your salary goes down, you don't get VA benefits on time anymore. It doesn't put a dent in the deficit, but they get to feel good like they did something. It's pay for your cake and don't get to eat it. It's suffer and don't get the payoff.
Well, the payoff is getting the fiscal house in order for everybody, for the public good. And that by doing so,
but if we're not a household gets a benefit from that. They get fiscal stability. They get fiscal flexibility. They can go and get more credit at better credit rates.
Mm-hmm. That's right. That's key. So if the
what do I as a vote, if I lose my job right now working for the VA today, and in 4 years, as part of a plan that's going to stabilize the budget, 4 years from now, what's the payoff that I'm getting? I don't, because you've already said that it's not fixing the debt situation.
The hope is that that person who's just been laid off, federal employee, maybe making $80,000 a year, is able to now go pick up a $90,000, $100,000 a year job in the private sector.
But that's ridiculous.
And at the same time, the government's outlays, right? So the budget deficit comes in because the government's no longer employing that person. The private sector is.
And I don't buy it. I don't like why.
Look, you may be right. We're going to find out. Okay, if these people in the that are getting laid off, if they don't find jobs, they're going to start showing up in the unemployment report. And it's not going to be a whole lot impact on employment. I think if all the federal employees are something like 1 or 2% of total employment, but they'll be in there, right? And they will. And that the communities in which have a high reliance on federal employees, if those people can't find jobs in either the public sector in their state and local governments or in the private sector, yes, there's going to be an impact.
If you can't guarantee that there's going to be a macroeconomic payoff for somebody losing their job in this employment market, why would we ever take that risk? Why has the word taxes not come out of your mouth yet?
It's interesting. I haven't mentioned taxes because what we're collecting in taxes is about where we should be. So this isn't really a revenue problem in and of itself. We are collecting, keep using as a percent of GDP. About 17% of GDP comes in revenues through all the different ways the government collects taxes. That's really the long-term average. And 20% has kind of been the absolute ceiling. The last time we even got close to 20% was when we balanced the budget. I think it was 2000. And it didn't even hit 20%, but it was close. And going back to the 1930s, under all of these different tax regimes, different administrations, so many different Congresses, no one's really been able to breach that 20% of GDP number. So, 17 is the average of where we've been. So the way I see it is that's kind of where, we should be and what we can obtain. If you want to sell me on we can go to 18% while not touching income tax, okay, wage earning taxes, leave them alone, I think me and a lot of other people that are voters would listen to that. But large tax increases on incomes, we've seen throughout, again, many administrations with different marginal tax rates, different tax codes, they have not been able to really exceed where we are now.
You said 17 is the average, 20% is the number we have never been able to get over. Is that a question of political will, or is there some sort of headwind that kicks in?
I don't really know. We haven't got there. Nobody's been able to do it. Why is that? I mean, there's probably some economic reasons, right? For every dollar or percentage you increase taxes, you increase the propensity to try to dodge the taxes. And eventually you charge too much rate that, people will find any way in which not to pay the taxes. Right? So you're trying to reach some efficient frontier, some perfect number of matching tax rate to maximum tax collected.
So if you're willing to gamble with the livelihoods of all federal workers, even though it's just a fractional part of the problem, why shouldn't we spend that exact same amount of energy trying to get from 17% back to 20%?
Look, I'm not. I think what would have been a better case was reviewing in detail every one of these people who are being cut, like really what they do a deep dive analysis, include all the cabinet secretaries as you see fit, release some kind of report, and have something that's sellable to people that isn't as defensible that for Democrats. For example, you have all these federal workers. You have them today. Before you fire them, what was the kind of analysis to do to maybe make them more productive? Can the government get more out of their work? Right? It was kind of just like, hey, we're coming in, office space, what do you do? You're fired.
Do you really think that there's enough cuts there to be had if Trump's chainsaw approach is only putting barely a dent in the problem?
No, not from that perspective. No, I mean, you ultimately, if you're not going to raise taxes, and I think trying to sell, you're going to grow your way out of it. While I'll listen, that's probably not the first way out. The first way out is talking about these entitlements.
So we're back to extreme austerity. Cutting entitlements, You got to admit that that's extreme austerity. I don't care what the numbers say. For the impact that it has on the ground, the things that average Americans would feel, that's like extreme austerity.
All right, well, look, the Social Security, I don't know about Medicare. Social Security has like a 1%, 1.5% deficit. We can solve that. We could solve that tomorrow if we had the political will. I mean, we don't have to take austerity for that. We don't have to cut benefits for that. We can take the cap off of the taxes on Social Security wages, right? That would solve like half of that problem. You could make up the difference elsewhere, right? Those are ways that you can solve that problem. We just need the political will to do it.
What's your confidence that the Trump administration is going to pursue this strategy coherently and cohesively for the next 4 years?
My confidence is low of what we've recently seen. I mean, I'm still saying that we're not going to get the tariffs on April 2nd, but maybe we're going to get them. And there's so much uncertainty. And no one who's a market participant or someone who's in my business is saying, hey, we expect absolute certainty. But we need to narrow the range of outcomes. We're not doing that. And so far, they're not giving credible reports and saying, hey, we're going to cut A, B, C, D, just like you would in a business environment. No, they're just coming in with literally a chainsaw and saying this is what we're cutting. So I can't say I have a lot of confidence in it. We still haven't seen a bill.
Republicans are going to trick people into making them think that they're serious about doing something about the debt and the deficit, like they did during the last 3 Republican administrations. They're going to use that as an excuse to make sure the Democrats can't spend any money. They're going to cut taxes so that they're actually making the problem worse on the revenue side. And we end up with this fake austerity where we get the cuts that hurt people, but we don't get the financial stability that would actually improve everybody's economic standing in the long term. We pay for the cake and we don't get to eat it. And if we're going to restore good, functioning, competent government, the kind of government that does the things that you're talking about, that goes in with the scalpel, then we need to be able to sell the American people on the idea, just the general concept that short-term sacrifices can make us all stronger in the long run. Because if they don't, we're going to end up in this cycle. Fake cuts, fake austerity, people suffer, no economic stability. What do people do when they're in that situation? They vote for more populists. What do the populists do? They talk a big game about the deficit. Then they run up the debt anyway, just like Trump did during his first term. They lower taxes because that's how populists stay popular. And they make it worse.
You're walking through what Latam countries have done basically since their debt crisis in the early 80s.
And what I'm saying is that if we're going to actually restore faith in the American people, that they can get long-term stability for their short-term sacrifices. And I need people like you in conversations like this, people who care about our economy, people who care about the budget, people who actually feel in their souls that need when they're spending money to spend it responsibly, to get as excited about Democrats' investments in the American people and to get as excited about solving this problem on the revenue side as you do when Trump wheels out a hedge fund manager to tell you all about how his cuts are going to be so responsible in the long term, when we see in the short term, when we see on our eyes and ears, when we turn on the nightly news, it's all populist hot air.
Couple things. First, look, I'm not sold on this. I'm not sold that it's going to work out. I'm not exactly confident it's going to work out necessarily either, given exactly what you said, what we're seeing on the ground. Second, I think it's a messaging problem about, you're saying, the cuts and this and that. So what can Democrats do? Well, it'd be nice if Democrats flip the script and let them call for cuts. Let them call for some scalpel cuts, make them public, and try to wrestle some of the narrative away from Republicans. And if you want to do this kind of you're saying adult way of doing it, lead from the front on that, say stuff like that. And then if you can get any traction on the back end, maybe you can come in with some, tax revenue proposals that likewise are scalpels and go after things that could be popular, like conspicuous consumption.
Well, that's why I started this podcast. Because when it comes to this issue, when it comes to that very thing that you're saying, Democrats are not the problem. Democrats are the problem on a lot of things. I'm not very happy with the Democratic Party right now, don't get me wrong. But when it comes to being responsible with money when they're in office, that is something that Democrats have excelled in our entire lifetimes. I need people like you to get as excited about the soft landing as you guys get about the possibility of cutting $2 trillion.
Well, I think the soft landing was, forget it. I don't even want to get into that. Look, the cuts are from my perspective. My argument for cuts is really coming from the spending that we just did. The pandemic stuff that we talked about. That's the driver for this stuff. Like, we got to get that shit under control. We really do. The rate of change is decidedly negative and worsening. I mean, and people are don't seem to care about it, but you're living through it. You're living through it by higher interest rates right now.
Well, I think people do care. I think Democratic presidents have demonstrated by their actions that they do care, and I think that voters care. I think that the debt makes voters really, really uncomfortable. It just creates uncertainty, and they do want to address it. But I think that they've lost all faith in our elected leaders in both parties to address this problem responsibly, to actually have a 4-year plan and stick through it no matter what happens in the midterms, no matter what happens in the next election. And I think that if they don't have that confidence that the elected leaders of both parties are going to be responsible about this issue, then it just becomes a weapon. It just becomes a cudgel. It just allows Democrats to say Republican tax cuts are irresponsible, and Republicans could say Democratic spending is irresponsible. And in practice, people are suffering. And if I'm going to be really responsible on this issue, if I'm going to go to the super liberals and say, I completely agree, anybody who says that we need to balance the budget, anybody who says that we need to eliminate the deficit is full of nonsense. But we do have to take this stuff seriously. We do have to maintain the confidence of the national creditors market. Then I need folks like you to give Democrats a lot of credit when they are actually responsible about this. And two, I need you to take increasing taxes in a surgical manner, the way that you're describing for all the tax cuts. I need you to get as excited about being smart about increasing revenue as you are about cutting spending.
Look, I definitely agree that your point about it being a confidence game is it. And, these populist movements, they get traction because people lose confidence. I think if we can actually correct this fiscal situation that we have, and as I said, to correct it is still a deficit. But the reserve currency that we have, that privilege that we need to service, the way we service that privilege is to kind of show that we can maintain a 3% deficit. Right. And with that'll bring back confidence in the people that you're talking about. So, I hope you interpret that as meaning you at least halfway.
Can we agree that the way in which Trump is cutting right now is bad for the economy and is not giving us a proportional payoff in terms of addressing our fiscal situation? And I say that for three reasons. One, chainsaw, not a scalpel. Two, we're seeing the economic downturn that seems to be caused by it. And three, they're not backed by Congress. If these cuts, if eliminating the Department of Education were backed by Congress, then again, we would know it was part of a long-term plan. It's not going to get overturned by the courts. It's not just a deferral of money that the next president's going to spend.
Yeah, I think if this was agreed by Congress and then signed by the president, you would see less commotion than there is. And whether I actually believe that the commotion around these cuts is more hurtful to GDP and economic growth than it is the actual cuts themselves.
I'm so happy we're ending there, because at the end of the day, it's not about impressive proposals or big swings. It's about finding those people who love going through spreadsheets line by line, who feel a deep-seated compulsion to make sure every penny is spent responsibly, and putting them in charge instead of guys who jump up on stage with a chainsaw. I know I found somebody like that in Banker Bill to co-host this podcast with me, and I'm so glad that we found you to talk it all out. Thank you for listening to this episode of Is It Bad for the Economy? Please give us those 5 stars, and if you have a great idea for our next episode, please leave it in your incredibly complimentary review. We're so glad you joined us. We'll see you in 2 weeks.